By the late 19th century, the many hundreds of Deal, Warmer and Kingsdown boatmen working from the beach were being whittled down through lack of employment. The lucrative ship attendance work had almost dried up with the coming of steamships that no longer needed to anchor in the Downs. However, the men that were left worked to remain in luggers and helped as beach hands. The lugger was a sturdy local craft built for the beach and around 40 feet in length, carrying a crew of up to 20 hands. One such lugger, the Reform, was stationed south of the pier, and with her bow to the sea was always ready to launch when needed. On the morning of the 16th of January 1871, just before daylight, the crew of the Reform were looking out to sea when they saw a flare which had been sent up from a ship seeking help. At the time there was a gale of wind blowing from the south-southwest. The tide was on the way in and large waves were rolling in along shore. The crew of the Reform started getting ready for a launch, but being so early in the morning they were lacking available beach hands. This would make launching difficult, as timing in the land of the lower Grease Woods position was essential. 4 of the 15 crew decided they would forfeit their place aboard and lay the lower woods in the surf to get a successful launch. With the boat made ready and the haul-off rope passed onto the bell roller, an eye was kept on the rolling seas for a lull. When this came, the boat was let go off its chain. She rapidly slid down the beach, but with mistiming she struck a huge swell and came to a sudden halt. Encumbered by their thick clothing and oilskins, the men pulled on the haul-off rope, which was secured to an anchor out to sea. Their physical efforts were to heave the boat through the surf and have enough water under the keel to get her afloat. They managed and were just about to jettison the haul-off rope and hoist the sail when they met a complication which became fatal for most of them. As they tried to jettison the haul-off rope, it became jammed on the hull of the lugger. With the huge waves continuously bearing down on her, she became unmanageable. While trying to free the rope, the Reform quickly drifted onto the pier, stern first. The pier had always been a hindrance for the longshoremen and an obstacle to their boat since it was built in 1864. In the days of sail they would have to make many short tacks to position their boats for coming ashore or after launching to avoid it. This time they could not. As the Reform struck the rusty cast iron piles of the pier, her masts got stuck in the framework and were wrenched out of their steps, severely damaging her hull. Dawn started to emerge as the Reform was taking a battering against the pier legs, ripping out her sides. More boatmen had arrived on the beach and were watching the events that were happening before their eyes, knowing that the outcome would end in tragedy. A couple of boatmen with ropes jumped over the closed pier turnstiles to try and help the struggling men in the Reform below to escape, but with no avail. They watched forlornly as the Reform started to sink and shed the crew into the raging and freezing sea. The crew of the Reform tried to shed their heavy garments before they were engulfed into the waves and debris of their boat. It didn't take long for the cold seawater to soak through their clothing and shock them into the severity of the situation as they started to cry for help. Many Deal boatmen didn't wear life jackets and couldn't swim, as the cumbersome cork waistcoats of the time restricted their movement. Within minutes, the tide and wind had swept them clear of the pier and beach, and was rapidly pushing them north towards Sandown Castle. Some of the crew clutched onto anything that floated from their wrecked craft, and tried to keep their heads above the swirling sea and waves. Onlookers walked along the beach, watching them, hearing their cries for help, yet were unable to assist in any way. Edward Hanger, the skipper of the North End lugger Early Morn, was sheltering from the weather in their lookout hut on the beach at North Deal. He and his crew were alerted by concerned bystanders that there were bodies in the water drifting his way. On looking, he saw that a small galley punt had managed to get afloat, but was helpless and unable to save the men in the severe weather and seas. As they walked towards Sandown Castle, observing helplessly the remaining survivors of the Reform, their cries for help were slowly lessening. Edward Hanger, William Stanton, Edward Forster and Alfred Redsall commandeered the last fishing boat, which was on the beach close to Sandown Castle. They hurriedly offloaded the fishing gear out of the boat, pushed her down the beach and attempted a launch, only to be knocked back by the heavy breaking waves. Now they knew their quest was slipping out of their grasp, and in haste made the boat ready again for another launch. This time they did manage to get afloat. Rowing towards Sandown Castle, they spotted one of the drowning men floating a few yards out. With caution they backed up the fishing boat with their oars and recovered him. This was William Goymer. They then saw another crewman clinging onto the Reform's mast. Quickly they got their boat alongside the Reform and hauled him on board. This turned out to be John Bailey. The rescuers grasped Thomas Baker, who had a death grip on the sail. They had to physically pry his fingers free. He was barely conscious and his condition was extremely serious. Laying him across the main thwart, they pumped his body hard, removing a quantity of seawater he had swallowed. With the seas getting rougher and no other victims from the Reform to be seen, they made for the shore just north of Sandown Castle. On beaching the boat, a following sea pushed a small vessel well up onto the beach, out of harm's way. The 3 half-drowned men were taken to the Chequers Inn to be cared for, with Thomas Baker needing the most attention. 8 bodies were eventually washed ashore and recovered from the crew of the Reform on that day of January the 16th, 1871. Their ages ranged from 22 to 56 years of age. 5 days later, the Deal longshoremen were buried in Hamilton Road Cemetery, Deal. The procession was led by the Mayor of Deal, with 96 boatmen as bearers, and 300 boatmen from Deal, Walmer and Kingsdown bringing up the rear of this lengthy cortege.